Welcome to our latest broadcast in Kyiv Post. I'm Bohdan Nahaylo, the chief editor, and I'm very happy to have our colleague from the US, our Washington correspondent. We call him the Washington Insider, Jason Smart. Jason, it's good that you're here at this moment because a lot is happening in Washington, not all of it good for Ukraine. You've been following this very closely. In fact, you've written about it today for us. Can you tell us in a few words what are the main takeaways and, more importantly, what are the implications for Ukraine?
So the biggest thing that's happening now is simply, as you saw yesterday, the Senate voted against Ukraine. The Senate was thought to be the easier of the two. The House of Representatives, controlled by Republicans, was thought to be harder. But in the case of the Senate, the Democrats were not able to convince 9 Republicans to come over to vote with them. And so it didn't go through. Now, unfortunately, next week is the last week that the Senate is in session before Christmas holidays. It seems likely they'll stay in session, though, afterwards. That's something that the legislative body's head can choose to do, and he probably will, because there is an urgency of getting aid for Ukraine as well as for Israel. Now, what are the implications? I would argue that the biggest implication here is just how much Washington has changed. A year ago, Washington was full of Ukrainian flags. There was huge support. The president was able to get through a lot of different things, 7 pieces of legislation to support Ukraine. Today, that's no longer the case. It's clearly going to be an uphill battle going forward.
And why do you think that is? Is it just fatigue, Ukraine fatigue, or are there other issues that are driving Ukraine off the radar screen?
Well, there's been a host of factors. Amongst those factors is, yes, there's certainly Ukraine fatigue. We're nearing the 2-year anniversary since the full-scale invasion. The population in the U.S., has moved on to other things, and it's just no longer the central issue for them. There's only so much they can read about Ukraine before it becomes old news, no matter what the story is.
So, what is the central issue in the States these days?
So by far, the biggest issue is immigration. The Republicans are specifically trying to tie the assistance for Ukraine to immigration. That is, unless the White House is willing to go along with very serious reforms of how immigration and the asylum process work, they're not going to vote for Ukraine. And we see in the polling that 58% of Republicans list immigration as the top or the second top issue for them in all the polling that's come out. So it seems very clear that this needs to be addressed. Going forward, it's going to be very difficult for the White House to continue avoiding this if it does want to help Ukraine get the assistance.
So, how has President Biden reacted to this?
So President Biden has shown a lot of leadership with this. At the same time, the tenure of the White House has changed. There's a lot more, I wouldn't say alarmism, but concern being expressed. And that concern has included even yesterday, President Biden made remarks. He mentioned Putin by name 11 times in a speech, which is quite unusual. And he also raised the possibility that Ukraine could be taken by Putin. It is a real thing that could happen. This cannot be ruled out. And if Ukraine is deprived of munitions and deprived the weaponry that it needs to defend itself, that is realistic. It could happen.
But is Ukraine, you mentioned what happened on Wednesday, is Ukraine getting a fair hearing in the media in the US these days?
I think that overall the U.S. media is very favorable to Ukraine. I see that the support there is good. If you look at the daily papers in the U.S., Ukraine does come up a lot still. But unfortunately, it seems that the average rank and file voter doesn't really connect with that as much. It's no longer a pressing issue for them. About 1% of Republicans list Ukraine as being the top issue for them in the next elections.
Well, and yesterday I think we had the fourth debate, Republican debate before their primary, connected with the forthcoming presidential election. What do we make of that?
So during the debates, we saw what we've seen in the previous debates. Nikki Haley, as well as Chris Christie, have shown very strong support for Ukraine. It's very clear that they both understand that Ukraine is very important, but it's got an entire geopolitical context as well. It's very important, and that Ukraine's victory is something that will help provide security for all of Europe, and also provide security for other places like Taiwan. So if the U.S. were to back out now, that provides a huge number of problems for America's interests going forward for many years to come.
And who was the victor then in this debate?
Well, sadly, it would appear that President Donald Trump, who did not participate in the debate, was the winner. Between the fighting that occurred between the four candidates in the debate, the lack of clear messaging they were probably able to convey, polling numbers show that Donald Trump has continued to grow in the ratings over the past several months.
And yet, President Biden doesn't think that Trump will be reelected as president again.
Well, Biden, of course, is hopeful that he'll be reelected as president. A lot of people think, though, there's a good chance he'll go through the primaries, and he might very well at that point decide to put in somebody else to be the Democratic nominee.
President Biden, that is.
That is.
Okay, is there any silver lining in these dark clouds?
Well, I think the silver lining here is that the Republicans, I'm quite sure, will in the end come through on this. Because let's face the reality, it's in no way a victory for the Republicans if Ukraine were to be overrun by Russians. That would look disastrous. And it's something that they'd be held account for by the voters going into next year's election cycle. So I think that's something that they're not willing to take the risk of. I really do think in the end, they will vote to assist Ukraine.
You haven't mentioned Gaza. You haven't mentioned, well, in passing, you've mentioned Israel. To what extent is this still center stage in terms of international concerns for the American political elite and for the public?
So it's quite surprising, actually. Israel has also sort of fallen off the pages of the news. I mean, it is getting a lot of press still, but for Americans, it doesn't come up as a top issue. About 34% of Americans think that we should be sending more assistance to Israel now. About 4% say we should be assisting the Palestinians. But the rest say they're sort of indifferent to the entire situation.
Okay, for the longer term, what can we expect? What should we be watching in the next months, say?
In the immediate future, I think we'll see a few things go on. I think that one, we'll see a deal finally brokered between Democrats and Republicans, and in exchange for immigration reform, which the Republicans want to have going into the election cycle to be able to show that they've accomplished something in their tenure, the Democrats will go along with that, which will allow the Republicans to go along with aid for Ukraine. When the aid for Ukraine goes through, I think it'll reinvigorate the efforts here in Kyiv.
Thank you, Jason. I've been talking to Jason Smart, Kyiv Post's Washington insider, who is visiting us in Kyiv at this moment. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Bohdan.